Well, good morning to everyone that has just joined us, and hello to everyone that's watching the replay. Welcome to another one of the PCA's online learning webinars. This time it's all about approved document F update. Will it finally ensure proper ventilation in existing buildings? I am your host, Andy Ferguson, and today I'm pleased to welcome back my colleague, PCA's technical manager, James Berry. James, how are you this morning?
Very well. I don't feel like I've had an opportunity to talk yet, but there we are. I'm sure I'll get my turn in a minute.
Well, I'm just actually realising our time. We were a little bit late joining, folks, so I'm probably thinking we're going to have to skip over that part, James. But to those that are just joining us, because I can see there has been a large bunch of people that have just joined us over the last minute or so. If you have any questions over the course of the webinar, first place I just want to point you to is to the chat facility down the right or the left-hand side. If you're on the desktop, on the mobile, it will just be at the below the presentation screen. All you need to do is use the chat facility, the comment facility, and send us your question. If you want, you can also email a question to me at andy@property-care.org. and I can pick up your questions, and at the end, I can certainly pose them to James. So, James, I can see we're bang on 9 o'clock. The new approved document F. Well, I suppose for some time now, we've known that the previous version of approved document F for ventilation has only really impacted on new builds. To a large degree, it's a fraction of the households across the UK, especially when you raise the point that the vast majority of ventilation solutions are getting pushed into existing homes. So for some time now, you and I know that the PCA Ventilation Group has been fighting hard to try and change this and improve the existing building ventilations. So I suppose the key question is the new improved document F finally the solution? Does it close this loophole in the building regs? And will we finally ensure we get proper ventilation in existing homes? Some big questions, James. I suppose it's over to you.
How about that for an intro then? Morning, everybody. It's, having a look at the list of who's there. It's a nice mixture, a lot of familiar names, a lot of names that I don't recognise. So, thank you for joining. Good to have you all here. So that's great. It always feels a bit weird when we're talking about things, ventilation in the middle of June. Looking out the window here, I can see blue skies, the scattered clouds and all of that. So it always feels like a strange thing to be talking about ventilation in June. But there is a justified reason. So it sounds like the sun is shining just about everywhere. Bar, I think someone was in Perthshire and it sounded like it was raining. But, that just seems to live up to all the stereotypes, doesn't it? But anyway, yes, ventilation in June. There is a reason we've decided to do this webinar now. And in case you haven't realised, there was an update to a range of the building regs, principally part L, F and O. L and F are existing documents that have been revised. L is consumption of fuel. F means ventilation. And O is an entirely new document, which is overheating. The one obviously we're going to be focusing on today is going to be approved document F, because that's the one that's sort of moisture related, and that's for probably the vast majority is sort of where our heart lies and sort of where most of our interest is. So that's where we're going to be looking at today. A lot of us will deal with ventilation in existing buildings, so that's going to be the focus as well. So the new document was sort of published in December last year to virtually no fanfare. You'd be forgiven for thinking they were just sort of trying to get it out there quickly. And it came into force on the 15th of June. So if you have, say for argument's sake, a new build, if you have submitted an application prior to the 15th of June, you can follow the old regs, and then you have a year before you need to start the works. If you don't do it within that year, then you need to comply to the building to the new regs, and equally, if you submit an application after that date, you need to comply with the old regs. For new build sites, that is on an individual property, not on a site basis. So you can't put in an application for an entire site, do it to the old regs. You need to do it per individual property as well. So, of course, we're not going to cover all the changes. We've only got 40 minutes or, 40, 50 minutes, and we're going to be pushing it. And it might even be the first time that Andy tells me I need to shut up. So this might be an unusual one. And I'll be covering sort of most of the major changes as I perceive it, or as we perceive it as an industry. But it won't be covering every minute little change. But it's out there. It's now out there for industry to sort of adopt and sort of roll out there. And we're going to be sort of dissecting what some of those changes will mean, or likely changes will mean for industry. So first hurdle, can I change to the next slide? There we are, let that work perfectly. So why the change? So it is, unfortunately, 5 years since the tragic events of Grenfell, 5 years this month, where we were promised a major shake-up of the building regs. So the building regs are there to keep us safe, is the long and short of it. They are there for the health and well-being of those that are in and around buildings, which is absolutely what they should be there for. So we were expecting wholesale changes to the building regs anyway. However, the driver, particularly for these three documents, has been slightly different. We were, in case you've been living under a rock, you will have undoubtedly noticed that public perception for climate change has changed quite drastically. Gone are the days where you used to have a tie-dye t-shirt and dreadlocks to, be advocating for climate change. Now I think it is sort of much wider accepted. So in that bottom right-hand corner there, we've got Extinction Rebellion, quite prolific pre-pandemic. They were causing a lot of uproar and getting on a lot of people's nerves, and perhaps the way that they got their message across didn't appear, or wasn't necessarily everyone's cup of tea. But despite that, I think there was a lot more sympathy to their cause. The top right picture is probably going to have a lot less sympathy towards. So last year we had COP26, which was a conference on climate change up in Glasgow. And there we have the President of the United States turning up to a conference on climate change in a motorcade of some 40 plus gas guzzling vehicles. Smacks of hypocrisy somewhat. However, what has happened is there has been a massive shift in public perception and also policy when it comes to climate change. And what we will have seen, or what we have got, is the future home standards coming out in 2025, which is aimed at future-proofing our houses. So by 2025, our homes will be, or new homes will be 75% lower carbon emissions than what they were on the old regs. What we've got now, or these changes are for, is sort of an interim measure. So for two reasons, as I see it. One, if we were just going to go straight to 75% lower carbon emissions, would become as a massive shock. So we need a bit of a transition period there. But equally, we can't just wait and expect people to do it in 3 years. There needs to be sort of this easing in. And this is what we've got now, is this sort of easing in period. So that is one of the drivers, and you'll see that when we start looking at the changes as to what they see coming down the track with regards to climate change and the changes to our building stock. So that is one of the drivers for the changes to approved document F. Now, personally, I think there's been a greater reason for the change for ADF, approved document F, and that is I last did a webinar a year ago that was on ventilation, and we looked at a study that was commissioned by the Ministry, then the Ministry of Housing, Local Government and Communities, now the Department for Levelling Up, and I forget the rest. But so they looked at 80 new build properties across a number of sites. And out of those 80 new build properties, only 3 complied with the building regs, which is shocking. They're the minimum standards. And if we can't get it right in new builds, what hope do we have for existing builds? Now, hopefully, with a bit of luck, this was sent to me as you know, a solution for getting around ventilation in an existing build. So what we've got there is a passive vent install, and just to show, you know, there's the outside as well. This was a ventilation solution that was installed that someone has sent to me. You will notice that they've done that. Obviously, it's a clear bodge, and this is what the problem with ventilation is. People are getting away with shocking standards. And we saw that with the AECOM study, and we're seeing people doing it sort of inappropriately now. They've still got the trickle vent shut, but, you know, we'll go into that a bit later. So the problem is approved document F isn't unfortunately being followed. That couldn't happen, you know. Hopefully the tide is turning now when it comes to public perception for the requirement for ventilation. We've got the social landlords bill, which was recently discussed in Parliament, so we're hoping that will make a change. Sort of pre-lockdown, we had the Fitness for Habitation Act, so hopefully the tide is starting to turn, and that sort of thing is no longer going to be acceptable. Now, we at the RVG, for those that aren't familiar, the Property Care Association set up a residential ventilation group, which was to try and cast the spotlight on residential ventilation and improve standards when it comes to ventilation in existing buildings. Now, we have been quite vocal and were very much trying to get a revision to the building regs. The reason we're after a revision was because what we wanted to see, much like you've got in Part L, where you have an L1A and an L1B. So L1A looks at new builds, L1B looks at existing builds. We wanted to see something like that replicated in ventilation. So that was what we were lobbying for. And now there are two documents. However, they're not quite the split that we would have wanted. So we now have Volume 1, Volume 2. Approved document F, Volume 1 looks at dwellings. Volume 2 looks at buildings other than dwellings. A couple of caveats, or a caveat, I guess. I am only going to be looking at the English version of the regs. The Welsh version has recently come out, Paul. I know you're listening, but we're just going to be looking at the English version. The Welsh version has also just been amended. They are very, very similar. There are some slight differences, and actually, to some degree, I think the Welsh regs are clearer. But we will touch on that in a bit later. So I guess the big question, if we've got two regs and the difference is dwellings and non-dwellings, what is a dwelling? So a dwelling is a self-contained unit designed to accommodate a single household. So essentially, you know, a terraced house, whatever, you know, semi-detached house, a typical house, a flat. What it doesn't include is things like housing of multiple occupancy, so HMOs, where you might share a single kitchen. That would then come into buildings other than dwellings. So halls of residence, hotels, hostels, all fall into buildings other than dwellings. If it's a single, designed to accommodate a single household, then it's dwellings. That's where we're going to be looking at today, is Volume 1. So the other big change to the document as well, for those that are familiar with the previous version, we had the Domestic Ventilation Compliance Guide. That has now been scrapped. So with that has been, well, I say scrapped, it hasn't been scrapped, it's been brought into approved document F. So it is all in one place. So the Domestic Ventilation Compliance Guide was very much around sort of commissioning and provided all the information, commissioning sheets, things like that. Rather than having that as a separate document, that has now been incorporated into ADF. I personally think that is the right move. Whilst there was a lot of good information in the Domestic Ventilation Compliance Guide, having it as a separate document I always saw as a barrier to compliance, because if you're detaching that information, people are less likely to go find it and less likely to follow it. So having that in one place is, in my mind, absolutely the right thing to do, provided you get all the information across from the previous version. The other change or the other big goal that they were looking to do with this was simplification. Now, if you'd read the old ADF, it was quite impenetrable. It wasn't necessarily easy to read. And I think that was the case for a lot of the building regs, not just necessarily ADF. But ultimately, this is where I always thought that building regs fell down is a lot of them were written and sort of were aimed at almost academic level, which is fine, but actually it's the guy that's on site that needs to understand it, because he's the one that needs to understand what he's doing. They have tried to simplify this document, and actually, as far as sort of readability goes, I think they have done a pretty good job with that. So if you look at it, it does sort of flow a lot better. There are some areas where I think are perhaps contradictory or not quite clear and take open to a bit of interpretation. And we're going to sort of look through those as we go sort of through this today. But as far as simplification goes, actually, to some degree, I think they get a tick for that. So good on. So what are the requirements of approved document F? What is the goal? So if you were familiar with the old version, essentially these have not changed. There are two requirements. There shall be adequate means of ventilation provided for people in the building, which is absolutely there should. If you're in a building, there should be enough ventilation in there. Why do you need ventilation? There is obviously humidity. You need to be able to control humidity to prevent sort of build up of moisture, to prevent mold growth, that sort of stuff. But there's more to it than that. It's there to control VOCs, pollutants, that sort of stuff. We need it to regulate temperature. We need it for fuel burning appliances. We need it to breathe. So ventilation is not solely about moisture. It's probably the bit that we all recognize, but there is much, much more to it. And it's worth bearing that in mind. The second part for the requirements of approved document F is that fixed systems for mechanical ventilation and any associated controls must be commissioned by testing and adjusting to secure the necessary objectives. So what you must do is achieve, or you must provide adequate ventilation. Not only must you provide adequate ventilation, but then you must test and commission to prove that you've got there, which is simple enough. Actually, as far as that bit goes, I think whilst it was broken because it wasn't being followed, is the right thing to have done. So the objectives as far as ADF goes remains the same. But when is it applicable? So you do not need to comply with ADF if it is a space where people do not normally go, is used solely for storage, or is a garage. So for those that are keen-eyed amongst you, and if anyone's already spotted that, that is the stairwell from 4 Privet Drive, which is Harry Potter's address from the Muggle world, and that is his bedroom under the stairs. So just for a bit of fun, with not a quiz or anything like that, perhaps in the chat, do you think Harry Potter's bedroom under the stairs would need to comply with building regs? Is it a place where people would normally go? Would it normally be used for storage? In this case, you've obviously got someone living there. So would you need to comply with approved document F? Just for fun, people's thoughts in the comments. Would you need to comply as far as ADF goes for his bedroom? So they're the areas where you don't need to comply. And then we have these exemptions, and the exemptions are areas where you may not fully need to comply with the building regs. And the exemptions are historic and traditional buildings, emergency repairs, minor works, and live works. I find one of these a bit uncomfortable, and we'll look at that in more detail, which is the historic exemptions and traditional buildings, partly because the term traditional buildings I find bizarre. You know, I live in a 1970s house, built as you'd expect, you know, cavity walls, tiled roof. It's as traditional build as you could possibly get. So traditional, I think, is far too wide sweeping term. But the historic exemptions, it goes on and provides a bit more detail. Historic buildings with a vapor permeable construction that both absorbs moisture and allows moisture to evaporate. And it gives you some examples, including Watland door, cob, stone, and constructions using lime render and mortar. You've got to bear in mind, probably the vast majority of the something like 8 million solid wall homes in the UK are probably built using a lime render. And arguably, there's some of the properties that might have the poorest provision for ventilation. So to my mind, it's a bit of a loophole. And equally, we've already established that ventilation isn't just about control of moisture. It's about so much more. It's about the control of pollutants. It's about control of temperature. And you're not going to get that. So the indoor air quality in these buildings that ultimately are probably going to be the ones that need bringing up to, if we're going to hit our carbon neutral goal the most, are probably going to be the ones that suffer the most, because there's this little loophole. You don't need to fully comply. What does that mean? And it does say as far as reasonably practicable, and that's where they think that they've sort of covered themselves. But for my mind, I think it's a little bit of a loophole. I don't think that, you know, a bit of lime render really is you know, a substitute for proper ventilation in my mind. Now, don't get me wrong, I am going to caveat it because I do get that there's an aesthetical point of view. And if you've got something like an attractive lime build, a listed building, sorry, you don't want to be sticking plastic grills on the front of it that may, you know, make it look unsightly and that sort of stuff. But there are ways and means around this, and that's where it comes to getting a proper experienced person, designer for ventilation in to help you. I put this in as a bit of an example. This is what was a former pub in my village. Now, unfortunately, this is an old photo, but it's the former wheat sheaf, and it's been purchased, it's been renovated, and it now looks absolutely stunning. They've tarted the whole thing up. They've repointed every elevation, or repointed in line, and it looks fantastic. However, in the middle of winter, I can guarantee, because you always walk past it, the windows are streaming with condensation. They are single pane, but you know that there are issues with indoor air quality in there. So this is just to show there shouldn't be an exception. I think, you know, we need to make sure that that reasonably practicable bit is followed as much as possible. Existing buildings. So this is where part of our concern, or our biggest area of concern with the previous version, lay. It wasn't particularly clear when you needed to comply with the building regs with existing buildings, and this has been very much addressed in this version of the building regs. So another big tick, actually. When do they apply? So they apply when adding habitable room, when adding a wet room, replacing part of a ventilation system, including extract fans. So if you're replacing a fan, you then need to comply with the building regs, even if it's just part. So any part of the ventilation system, you need to comply. Refurbishment of kitchens and bathrooms. So if you're doing those, then you need to comply with the building regs. You also need to comply when undertaking works that may impact the ventilation within that building. And then it gives sort of two examples for that. So that's either replacing windows and doors or doing energy efficiency works. As I mentioned in sort of, I think the second slide, something like that, there is going to be huge wholesale changes coming to the building stock if we are going to get to our carbon neutral goals. So there is going to be a huge amount of retrofit insulation that's going to be happening to our existing buildings. And this document is all about anticipating those changes, or a large part of this document is about anticipating those changes. So what it does is it says that ventilation should either meet approved document F when you're doing these works, or it should not be made worse. And how do you establish whether you are going to meet that or you're not making it worse? Well, they provide you a little table. Mr. Dawson, if you're listening, that's one of your pictures. Thank you very much. You know, the disasters of retrofit, particularly external wall. So they give you this table, and essentially it's much like a driving test, where you get a list of minors and a list of majors. And let's, for instance, you've got renewing loft insulation is a minor. Replacing less than 30% of your doors and windows, a minor. Replacing more than 30%, a major. And then you get this table, the next table. So essentially what you're allowed is 2 minors. Anything more than 2 minors, then you need to be considering ventilation. 1 major, and you need to consider your ventilation. Much like your driving test, if it is still like it was when I did mine all those many moons ago, 1 major is failed, but you're allowed several minors. But in this case, you're only allowed 2. We've also got, so that's essentially category A is your 2 minors. Then we have category B, and then we have category C. Essentially, the only difference between category B and category C, category B is will reduce, and the other one is significantly reduced ventilation. But the only difference is that category B and C is category C, you would need to have a specialist design a natural ventilation system, which leads us on nicely. So what is a natural ventilation system? So those, again, that are familiar with the previous regs, we had 4 ventilation strategies put into there, and it was given a numerical sort of numbering. Of course, numerical numbering, that's what numeracy is. But what do you think to that for a punch? You know, I think I've missed a vocation. 1, 2, 3, no more. That's Sunworthy, isn't it? But there we are. So we had system 1, background ventilators and intermittent extractor fans. System 2, passive stack ventilation. System 3, continuous running fans. And then system 4 was your MVHRs. Now, we have done away with the numeracy and we have done away with passive stack. So what we now have is different titles as well for that. So system 1 is now natural ventilation with intermittent extractor fans. We've done away with passive stack because it was only installed in less than 1% of new builds. I'll be brutally honest, I never encountered it during my time contracting. I never saw it in existing buildings. I don't even think I've seen it now. Well, I haven't seen it even during my tenure at the PCA. So it's not all that common. It has sort of now gone, or it's not referenced in the approved document. And we've got continuous running fans and the MVHR. The 3 strategies that are now listed in there all sort of follow this sort of same principles, and that is extraction from wet rooms, a supply of whole dwelling ventilation, and then that's got to be supplemented with purge ventilation to remove high concentrations. Now, we will look at purge ventilation, but that is essentially your ability to shift huge volumes of air very quickly, principally opening up your window. So all of the strategies that are in approved document F now follow those 3 principles. And then we'll quickly look at those 3 sort of strategies in a bit more detail, or how they might have changed slightly. So intermittent fans or natural ventilation, it now states it's only suitable for less airtight properties. Why is that the case? You know, these are your typical fans that you normally see and are probably, you know, come across on a daily basis, but they're only suitable for less airtight properties because when you think about it, they only work when they're told to work. They only work when either the operator pulls the cord, tells it to work and it does its thing, or they've got some minor element of humidity tracking or something like that, or there's some sort of computers or, you know, something tells it to operate. So the vast majority of the time, they're almost a version of purge ventilation to some degree because they're only doing the job when there's high humidity or whatever it may be. So because of that, you need a provision of background ventilation to supplement that, so you've got the fresh air for the remainder of the time. So that is why these systems are dependent on background ventilation, and that's why they're not suitable for less airtight properties. I think in reality, and I will, you know, quite happily hold my hands up here and sort of admit I'm perhaps a little naive on this, but my understanding is that ultimately any existing building would be, unless it's converted to a passive house, would be considered a less airtight property. But, you know, if anyone's got the calculations and I'm willing to share, you know, happy to take that all on board. But they should be fitted in all wet rooms. We've covered that, supported background. And the other thing that it does is it tells us that any sort of run on should be on for 15 minutes as well. Intermittent fan. So we still have our flow rates as before, and these haven't changed. So you've got kitchen, you've got a couple of options, 30 if it's unhood extracted to outside. If it's a separate fan, you need to be 60 litres a second. Utility rooms 30, bathroom 15, sanitary accommodation 6, or if it's sanitary, you can follow the guidance for purge ventilation. But that hasn't changed. That is the same as the old document. I struggle a little bit with this because I always think that why is a utility more than a bathroom? In my experience, the bathroom is going to produce more moisture. I assume they're making the assumption that everyone dries their clothes in the utility. I find that a little odd. It's just a thing. Extract terminal height. So where should the extractor fan be placed? So it should be as high as practicable in the room, and a maximum of 400 below the height of the ceiling. Good guidance, simple guidance. That's what we like about the changes to the new building regs. Note, there's not a pickle for oven hoods. Oven hoods, it simply says you should follow the manufacturer's guidance, or you should be between 650 mil or 750 mil above the hob. The flow rates you need, if you are using an oven hot hood, as part of your ventilation strategy, if it's actually going to outside, so ducting externally, then it could be 30 litres a second. If it's independent of your oven hood, then you need 60 litres a second. This is a new diagram for, and this is a bit ranty, so apologies, but this is a new diagram for the approved document F. I think it might actually be the only diagram that they've included in approved document F. And I find it a bit of a peculiar one, because I think this is such a simple premise that can be explained. Well, it's explained within that table that we've already looked at, or, you know, it can be complemented within a couple of lines. Given the lack of illustrations in ADF, you would have thought the ones they want to use, they want to make sure that they are the most impactful, and the ones that go into detail on the things that very often go wrong. For my mind, in the previous approved document, domestic ventilation compliance guide, we had a really good schematic about flexible ducting. Flexible ducting is the devil's work. It's what BISRIA say is responsible for most ventilation failures. Surely that would have been a better diagram to leave in, that had greater value than something that doesn't really explain a very difficult concept at all. Little rant over, there we are. As I say, you do need to have a supporting background ventilation. They need to be in each of your habitable rooms. It will vary depending on whether you've got a bungalow or whether you've got a two-story building. But there your rates. So 800 for 8,000 for rooms with 2 stories, except for your bathroom 4,000, and then but 10,000 on habitable rooms and kitchens in a bungalow. So we've covered that very quickly. Continuous running. We'll quickly go over this, but it can be either centralized or decentralized, the same as before. You don't need as much background ventilation. You only need sort of 4,000 per habitable room, but no background vents in wet rooms for obvious reasons, because what's going to happen if you've got a continuous running fan and a trickle vent in a wet room, you're just going to create a short circuit, and you know the ventilation isn't going to be doing what it's meant to be doing. The other thing that is quite neatly pointed out in this document, and it was actually included in the last one, but again, merit to this version because it is clearer, where you're discharging a continuous running system to, and in even a natural ventilation system. If you can imagine, if you've got something that's doing a relatively low volume, it's not necessarily going to have that much force behind it. It's going into a prevailing wind, then ultimately that might mean that the ventilation system is compromised for a large proportion of the time. So that's even when you're doing your surveys. If you know you've got continuous running, check where it's discharging to, because that may impede the system quite significantly. Continuous running fans, so they're the rates that you're expected to provide. These are the same minimum high rates that were in the previous document. There is, and much like the one before, you have to achieve those, and you also need to be able to achieve a whole house ventilation rate. And these are the rates that you are given for continuous running fans. So for a 1-bedroom, 19, 2-bedroom, 25, 3-bed, 31, and so on. There is another caveat to that. So they must also achieve a minimum of 0.3 litres per metre squared of the internal floor area of the building. So you need to do that calculation, and whichever one is the highest, you must follow that. For those that are familiar with the previous version of the document, that has jumped quite significantly. So previously we were at 13 rather than 19, 17 rather than 25, 21 rather than 31, and 25 to 37, and 29 to 43. So quite a big jump there. Now, I know some of you have sort of expressed this too. We've discussed it at the RVG as well, for those that have attended those. I don't think ventilation rates have ever been the problem. And we know from previous studies, like the one done by AECOM that we mentioned in the beginning, we weren't getting the flow rates we were meant to be getting. So upping the flow rates, in my mind, was never really where we were going wrong, or we weren't even getting to where we should have been in the first place. So moving them up actually is probably counterproductive, because if you look at what we're trying to achieve, particularly when we start talking about the carbon efficiency measures, if we're changing the air so to the volumes that are sort of detailed in this, then ultimately that is going to counteract any of the energy efficiency measures we offset, because you're once you've heated that air, you're getting rid of it a lot quicker. So you're going to be offsetting any gains you've got from, you know, retrofit measures, and your heating bills are going to go up because you're having to heat sort of fresher air. So to me, I'm not necessarily sure that was necessarily the prudent move. We should have tried to ensure that we were getting to the rates we were getting to before, rather than sort of moving the goalpost further away. Watch this space. We'll be providing some more stuff on that very soon. MVHR. So won't go on this for too long. You don't see it very often in retrofit. Very difficult to retrofit unless perhaps you've got a bungalow, but some guidance. You need, each habitable room requires a supply of fresh air. Terminals should be placed to avoid drafts. So we've seen it on some of the properties that we've looked, where you'll have the input like directly above the bed. What's worse, in the units we've seen, that actually the unit was massively underpowered as well. So to try and get up to the flow rates that they needed, they were having to ramp it up, making it noisy, and you know the rates of going through were just ridiculous. So it was never going to work, and actually that's going to be counterintuitive, because the people aren't going to operate the systems or use the systems, because they're, you know, if they're not sleeping, if they're lying there in bed and they've got this jar coming down, it ain't going to work. So for wet rooms, you're required to have the same minimum high rates as what we saw for the continuous running fans. With this, you need no background vents at all. Undercuts to doors. Now, this hasn't changed. This is the same as what was in the building regs, but I wanted to bring it up because I believe it's very important and very often overlooked. So you need undercuts to doors to ensure that there is good transfer of air throughout the dwelling. So that needs to be 10 mil above finished floors, or 20 mil above unfinished floors. You know, anecdotally, how often have you gone into properties and you normally see the bedroom with the mold growth in is the one that you're actually dragging the door along the carpet. And I think it actually makes a huge difference. I struggle to quantify that, and like I say, it's a bit anecdotal, but if you think about it, how many times have you seen that? So undercuts to doors, I think, make a huge difference. One of the other big changes to this document, and I know one of the reasons that people wanted to see change to this document, was more holistically to indoor air quality. So there is, like I say, more than just sort of the moisture aspect to it, and there's no point replacing indoor air with bad quality outdoor air. So this is telling us to be very, very careful as to where we take our external air with, and places greater emphasis on this. There's a whole new section. Well, section 2 is devoted to external pollutants, but it tells us to take away from local sources of pollution, such as busy roads, that sort of stuff. In this picture, you've got a PIV unit, which is, you know, taking air directly above a boiler flue, so not great. Purge ventilation, I mentioned this is obviously part of the key strategies, so apologies, still got a lot to get through, and I told you I'm probably going to make Andy a little bit nervous now, but there we are. So purge ventilation is required in each habitable room. It must be capable of doing 4 air changes an hour. It can be either through mechanical means or manual means, which is essentially opening a window. But you must take into consideration outside noise as well. So if it's onto a main busy road, you would need to take that into consideration as well. But purge ventilation is equally part of the ventilation strategy that is involved in approved document F and shouldn't be overlooked. It's just as important as the fans and everything else. Ducting. Ducting, as I say, is one of the big reasons why ventilation fails. The guidance that was set out in the domestic ventilation guide previously is pretty much replicated in this in text rather than through the diagram as mentioned. You know, it should be pulled taut. Stay away from flexible ducting. It's, you know, not good stuff. If you are to use it, pull it taut, less than 1.5 meters. The one thing that is strangely absent from this version of the document, though, is that in the previous versions, and I think probably in the domestic ventilation compliance guide, it said if you are running ducting through an uninsulated void, it should be, or unheated void, sorry, it should be insulated. We've not got that now. What we've got, that there seems to be any mention of that seems to have been removed. So what happens when you've got warm, moist air climbing up through an uninsulated, unheated void is you've got a risk of condensation. What's going to happen if it condenses in that ducting is going to cause it to run down, and you're going to end up with something like we've got in that picture there. So again, it seems a strange omission. You know, common sense would say to do it. Don't know why it's missed. Probably an oversight. Commissioning. So ventilation systems must be commissioned. As I say, the document has been taken out of the domestic ventilation compliance guide. That has now been pulled into the back of approved document F, and there it is on the right hand side of your screen there. And it says the commissioning should be provided within 5 days to the local authority as well. It contains all the information you'd expect. So who did the testing, what equipment they used to do the testing, what was the design flow rates, what flow rates were achieved, what's ventilation system, usual stuff is all on there as you'd expect. Flow rate testing, and now, you know, is probably where we might get a little contentious, but so flow rates for all mechanical vans should be tested, including intermittent fans, oven hoods, continuous supply and extra fans. And it should be tested in the same way. It should be tested using an anemometer, much like the one you've got there. So it can be a powered hood, or it can be your typical sort of Testo type models or whatever. Other brands are available. But it must be calibrated by someone UCAS accredited, and it must have an accuracy of plus minus 5%. And when you're doing it, you must shut all your doors and windows internally as well. Now, I've had sort of discussions with some people that sort of say they interpret the new version to say that you do not need to do flow rate testing for existing builds. And they base that on this here. So in section 4, which is the commissioning section, it says airflow rate testing and commissioning for airflow rates for mechanical ventilation in new dwellings must be measured. So it's the fact that it solely references new builds there, that they think they have interpreted that you don't need to do airflow rate testing for existing buildings. Now, I dispute that. I come at it from a different way, and the reason I come at it from a different sort of stance is, one, the requirements tell us that we need to. So if you go think back to requirements, it says we must provide adequate ventilation, then you must commission by testing to prove that you've achieved that objective. So even in the requirement, it says we must test. And this is the other section, which is the intention, which essentially says in the Secretary of State's view, you will comply in new and existing dwellings if you follow the guidance in paragraph 4.1 to 4.2 to achieve all of the following. But if you look at what 4.1 to 4.12 are, 4.9 is the section on flow rate testing, and the first thing it says is flow rate testing should happen on all mechanical ventilation. It doesn't say only on new builds or anything like that. And in this bit here, it says for all for existing dwellings. And then if you look at section B, commissioning results that show systems are operating as required to achieve adequate ventilation, including achieving the flow rate specified in this document. So for my mind, I think it is very, very clear that you need to do flow rate testing on existing buildings. The one thing I will say is apologies for the terribly unstraight lines there, but you kind of, I think it highlights the text you need. Why that last bit that was in there, 4.2, is a carbon copy from the last regs, and I personally think it's a bit of an oversight, but I think it's clear what the intentions are. You should be doing flow rate testing on existing builds. Long-term success, another quick but perhaps short rant. Once you commission a system, that's all very good and well, but for the long-term success of a ventilation system, it needs to work for the foreseeable future. It can't just work on the day you commission it. It's got to continue to work. How do you ensure that? Maintenance. So what the regs now say is that you need to provide information to the owner about the ventilation system and its maintenance, and you must provide that in a clear, non-technical way. What you've got there is a filter taken from the MVHR system that we showed you earlier. Clearly had never been maintained. It was 6 or 7 years old. The owner hadn't provided any information as to how to maintain it. They were never going to maintain it. And that's vital. And, another point of how important it is to you, have understanding of ventilation systems. So let's say we've established how difficult it is now to hit those whole house ventilation dwelling rates. Is that arguably going to tip the balance back to intermittent fans? And if we're doing that, there's a dependence on trickle vents. Now, let's be honest. How often do you see trickle vents left open? How often do the owners know what they're doing to use them? And that's why I think this bit is so very important. You need to be able to provide the relevant information to the owner. It must be done in a clear, non-technical way. Otherwise, actually, we're in for a world of pain. Right, missed opportunities. PIV is a bit Marmite, I think. There are those that absolutely love it, and there are those that don't love it so much, is probably the fair way of putting it. I genuinely believe it is a very useful tool to have in your arsenal in certain situations to control condensation in buildings. And there's some that will say that it's actually been entirely taken out of approved document F. I would disagree with that. Actually, if you look at the document, whilst there was only a fleeting reference to PIV in the previous version, this one actually says that other systems are applicable if it can be proved that it's acceptable. So I don't think it's dismissed them entirely. But actually, there's been over 1 million PIVs put into existing homes. It is probably one of the most commonly utilised means of ventilation in existing buildings. So why was this overlooked in the building regs? Surely this would have been an opportunity to try and establish some best practice, ensure that when it is put in right, it's done on sort of a universally accepted sort of standard, much like the PIV PCA guidance that we've written. So to me, that is perhaps a missed opportunity, and maybe it doesn't neatly fit into the strategies, those principles, the strategies that they put forward. But it's not. I personally don't think maybe it shouldn't be used in isolation. You still need to extract from your wet room, so you should be looking to make sure that you've got your extractor fans in there. But if you're looking to support your whole house ventilation rates, then actually maybe that's a very useful tool to do that. And maybe that should have been acknowledged and some guidance provided within there. Another area where there's still some ambiguity would be around the flow rate testing, which we've very much discussed. A bridge too far. Now, I will concede it's not a film that I've seen, but it kind of works very well for this slide. So in section 3.3, which is the existing building section, it talks about when it becomes applicable. So for works done to improve the ventilation of the dwelling that's not triggered by the building works in section A to G. Now, A to G is that section that I sort of alluded to earlier. So addition of wet rooms, addition of habitable rooms, the addition of retrofits, windows, doors, that sort of stuff. So it's basically, if you were going to put an extractor fan in because they had a condensation problem and they wanted to control ventilation in the bathroom. So if they just wanted to put a ventilation, an extract fan into their bathroom, it says basically section 1 should be followed. So if you're just putting an extract fan in to improve the ventilation, then follow section 1. Normally, I would say that is great guidance because we want people to follow the builder regs. Where I'm very conflicted on this is when you actually start boiling down to it. So to follow section 1, you then need to start looking at the provision for background ventilation. You'd need to start looking at, have they got ventilation in all of the other rooms, kitchens, bathrooms, utilities and all that, to follow the guidance in there. Are those fans, if they are there, are they doing the flow rates expected? So you now need to start doing this whole broader check. And let's be honest, with the best will in the world, if someone's having an extractor fan installed, just one in the bathroom or whatever it may be, to try and sort out a relatively minor condensation problem, they've now got to follow all of the guidance set out in section 1, which ultimately means if they're going to look to try and provide background ventilation, they might even be looking at whole new windows with trickle vents. So rather than being, you know, a job that might be a couple of £100, we're soon going to get into the thousands. So no one is ever going to follow that guidance because it's so unrealistic to be able to achieve it. So what my concerns are, if no one is able to get to full compliance because they've set the parameters so far, why don't we have something like on historic buildings where it's as far as reasonably practicable, and where we are encouraging people to take those steps to get there, rather than sort of saying, well, you must follow all of that guidance, because ultimately if they know they aren't going to get anywhere near it, they're unlikely to follow it. Andy, my last slide, so, you know, please don't fret anymore. And unfortunately, another one, sort of my interpretation of things. The other strange omission with this revision to the ADF is that any reference to competent persons seems to have been removed. So in the other ones, it was quite clear you could notify building control in advance of the install, or you could get it done by a competent person. There is no reference to a competent person in this version of building regs, which concerns me, because we go back to the ACOM study and all that information that we were looking at the start. People aren't doing it right anyway. So actually, if we're encouraging the work to be done by people that don't understand ventilation, then the chances are we're going to end up even wider of the mark. And there has never been a time for it to be done correctly. And that time has never been more important as it is now, particularly things as, like I mentioned, the social housing regulation bills coming in. Now, I've had this conversation with people and they've sort of said, well, there is a reference to competent persons within the manual for the building regs. So if anyone that's not familiar with the manual, that's sort of an overarching document that is tells you how to use the approved documents. Now, there is a reference that it says you can use a competent person for a mechanical ventilation system, but no one's going to be looking in there to try and, you know, everyone with the best will in the world, you know, that's great, but people will be looking at ADF in isolation and not necessarily with the building regs. So I think that's a bit concerning, and all credit to the Welsh version of building regs, because that is actually much clearer and it says, you know, get a competent person to do it. So that's where I think there's a bit of strength to their one. But the one thing that I would say, you know, actually, does this mean that there is greater importance? Because if people want to know that they are getting competent contractors now to do works and to try and, you know, get things as close to the building regs, and we've established how difficult that may potentially be now, you know, is there now a greater need for, you know, a trade association that can provide, you know, some form of consumer reassurance, I guess. So my big request is actually we need some clarity on that for the revision in 2025. So Andy, there you are, done.
Oh, well, fabby stuff. You caught me by surprise there. I wasn't ready with the trigger there, but fabby presentation. James, I do have a question straight off the back though, and it's simply just because of the answers that were coming in via the chat. Harry Potter's cupboard. So the space, does it comply with building regs?
Well,
yes or no?
Should it comply? My answer would probably be, if you've got a child sleeping under the stairs, you've probably got bigger issues than the building regs is probably. But ultimately, you know, if you've got someone living under there, then yeah, you probably should. But because someone is going there regularly. But
yes, I have to say the fake ventilation things I had a good wee chuckle with. I can't believe people would do stuff like that just to simply circumvent regulations. It's just madness. Actually, it probably brings me to a very good point, and probably the first question, which is actually my question rather than kind of drawing it into other people. Now, you kind of alluded earlier on that to a certain degree, and this is my words, by the way, not things, but to a certain degree, almost people were ignoring the building regulations for approved document F. I mean, if they were ignoring them beforehand, why are they going to comply with the regulations now that they've been revised? What is it that's going to drive them, incentivize them?
Yeah, a very good and valid point. And unfortunately, I'm not sure the revision is the answer to that. My biggest problem has always been that the regs were never that wrong. Actually, I always thought the guidance that was set out in approved document F was okay. The issue has always been enforcement of the regs, actually. And if we were following the guidance, even that was set out in the previous version, would have been fine, but we weren't. What is the driver to do it? You know, people have been getting away with it for far too long, and even now, as we're further down, I don't think there is that big stick or the carrot to get people to comply with it, because ultimately they are getting away with it. And I think, given the changes we've seen in this document, I think that there are chances, you know, I think we're likely to have people less skilled to be doing ventilation, doing installs, unfortunately, you know. And this is no disrespect to electricians, you know, they're very, very good, but unfortunately, most of them just haven't been trained or have, you know, the requisite understanding on ventilation systems. So unfortunately, you know, without any sort of nod as to the level of level of competence, you know, in the document, then unfortunately that's going to go further away.
Well, you've actually alluded onto a good question, and I do apologise for the person that was posing this on the chat. I have forgotten who did pose it, but on the notes that you were on, the comment you mentioned there about qualifications. I mean, what qualifications is there for installers in terms of?
Oh, well, there's the BPEC. Well, I don't think it was the BPEC. Now the NAPIT version, I think NIC, EIC do the competent persons in domestic ventilation. The problem is they are very, very much tailored to new build stuff. And we've seen the problems with regards to you know, existing builds, and unfortunately it would be great, and we should look to, you know, have a scheme where it is more applicable for existing buildings. Absolutely.
So I think Peter, just in the chat there, has just kind of posed an interesting question, which is maybe what I was alluding to with my first question. In your opinion, do you feel this new updated approved document F cuts the mustard, using Peter's words?
In parts, actually. As I say, there are some good bits. I think it still needs some ironing out or some fine tuning. So in that regard, no. There you are. There's an indecisive flip-floppy answer for you. So is it clearer? Yes. Do I think it's the answer? No, actually. Let's be committal. Let's say, actually, no, unfortunately, I think we've missed an opportunity. But let's be grateful we'll have another stab in 3 years' time.
Oh, fabulous. Well, guys, we're always interested in hearing your opinion as well on the chat. So, I mean, if you have an opinion on this, please do let us know. And if we can respond or draw in your comment, then we certainly will. James, I don't have a lot of questions for you, but if you can with these questions, be short and sharp, because we've only got a kind of couple of minutes. But I think starting off with a question from Callum Stevens, it actually talks about when you were mentioning about the different Welsh and English regulations. He's actually mentioned he appreciates your focus was on the English regs, but what are the major differences that you are aware of between the Scottish, Welsh, and English regs, if there is any differences really, or major differences?
You know, there's that one about the competent persons, but I have not gone into enough detail, particularly the Scottish one. I don't think I've ever really looked at that in the detail it probably warrants. I've only cast over the the Welsh one because of the conversations we were having about competent person. So I can't say I've drilled into enough of them to give that even a valid answer, to be honest. So apologies.
Well, no worries. But again, folks, if you are aware of any major differences, then please do let us know in the chat. We don't pretend to have all the answers, so we are keen to hear from you guys as well. Moving on to kind of the next question. Next question actually comes from Gavin McGregor. This is more kind of looking at the surveying side of things. Should a surveyor now be looking at ventilation and air management systems during the course of a level 2 and 3 survey? Should they now be taking document F and its building regulations into, I suppose, accountability?
Regardless of ADF, I think you should be looking at that anyway, because that's part of, the building services within that building, and they are there for you to see, whether it be visual check or whether you're checking flow rates or whatever. But yeah, absolutely, ventilation should always be part of your survey in my mind.
All right. Well, moving on, Peter Armfield is asking the questions associated with PIV. There is a couple others asking questions on this as well, so I have missed your name. I do apologise. So when it comes to proving if PIV is acceptable for building control, what do installers need to do?
Well, that's going to depend as to who you're trying to get it signed off by, doesn't it? How do you answer that one?
Is this a case of how long's a piece of string?
Yeah, have the conversation, see what they want for them to pacify. I can't really answer that because I'm not the building control. Let's say I think if I was looking at it, if I was trying to do it, I would be looking at it at the point of view is you've got the strategy that's set out in ADF, which is removal from your wet rooms, that you're complying with the purge, and then you're just making sure that you've got this good provision for background ventilation. So that would be the route I would be looking at if I was looking to put that in.
Okay. Next question comes from Douglas Jarham. Now, I am a little bit unsure what he's alluding to just at the end of this. I'm hoping this is technical language you might be aware of, but his comments come around PIV units. He's really looking to ask, what is your view on wall-mounted extractor fans? What he's suggesting is he seems to struggle finding extractor fans that consistently comply with the building regs of 601/per sec. That's the wee bit I'm unsure about. I'm assuming that's airflow stuff going through the ventilation. I'm a wee bit unsure myself. Do you understand where I'm coming from here?
Right, it's not really, but yeah, carry on. So what's the question?
Well, I suppose he's asking, what is your experience with the compliance of these wall-mounted units? He's alluding to that he's finding that often he's tripping across them and they're not compliant.
Okay, what guidance is he not complying with?
Well, it's during. My guess is from. My guess is from the comment is that he's going in, he's surveying, he's seeing that there's a wall-mounted extractor fans there. He feels that.
I would suggest, Andy, let me have his details, and we'll pick that one up afterwards. And I
agree, Douglas, and we will get back to you just on that one. Well, folks, I can see we're pretty much at our time just at the moment. There is one or two questions I've not been able to pose, but what I will do is similar to the question with Douglas. I will pass them on to James, and if he can get back to you, I'm sure he will get back to you. Just for those that are looking for for additional information, there are some links and some documents that you can kind of go to. There's an approved document F link there for yourself. There's also a blog that James actually wrote that highlights the kind of key changes from document F. You can also go to our residential ventilation library, where you will also find a variety of documents, codes of practice, technical, and also just general kind of guidance documents when it comes to ventilation. But there is some additional government-based documents there that are listed at the bottom, and one that James alluded to as well, which was the Fitness for Habitation Act 2018. I've just shared some of the links there in the chat if anyone is interested. In case you are keen to learn even more, the PCA does have some training courses which you can attend, starting off just at the top, our residential ventilation masterclass, our evaluating ventilation in existing buildings, and lastly, our domestic approach to understand condensation, atmospheric moisture, and mold. I clearly have not had enough coffee today. I feel I was stuttering over my words. But if you are interested to learn more, the link is on the screen there. Just go to property-care.org/training. Just before we go, our next webinar is not actually a webinar. As we have our 2022 International Structural Waterproofing Conference coming up on the 14th, what we plan to do is draw in some kind of highlights from that conference. We'll be looking to push this out towards end of July. So yes, please look out for it. I will have a page up on the website where you can stick your email address if you are interested, certainly in receiving the video. Watch this space for that coming along. The live webinars program will return as normal back in August. And for those that want to see what's upcoming, or for anything that we had broadcast before, where the link is on the screen there, just go to property-care.org/webinars. Last but not least, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone that joined us this morning, and a special thank you to yourself, James, for coming on with the presentation and sharing your knowledge. And last but not least, I just a big good morning to everyone, and hopefully you have a lovely rest of the day. Bye, everyone, and take care.